I was standing in my garage on a freezing January morning in Boise, Idaho, when I heard the sharp knock that would kick off the worst 3 weeks of my life. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees overnight, and my backup kerosene heater sat exactly where I had placed it the night before, keeping my workshop warm enough to finish the cabinet I was building for my daughter's birthday. That knock turned out to be Patricia Hendricks, the vice president of our Ridgewood Heights Homeowners Association, and she had brought company. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Patricia said, her thin lips pressed into a line so tight they practically disappeared. She was wearing a puffy cream-colored coat that made her look like an overstuffed marshmallow, and her blonde hair was teased into that particular style that seemed reserved for women who lived to enforce arbitrary rules. Behind her stood two other members of the HOA board I vaguely recognized from the quarterly meetings I tried to avoid. "Morning, Patricia," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" "We received a complaint about unsafe heating equipment being used in your garage," she announced, clutching a leather-bound notebook against her chest. "I need to inspect your property immediately." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "A complaint from who?" "That's confidential," she snapped. "Now, are you going to let us inspect, or do I need to cite you for obstruction as well?" Something about her attitude immediately set my teeth on edge, but I stepped aside anyway. I had nothing to hide. My kerosene heater was a brand-new Dina Glow model I had purchased from Home Depot 3 weeks earlier. It had all the safety certifications, automatic shut-off features, and I had read the manual cover to cover before firing it up the first time. Patricia marched into my garage like she was leading a military inspection, her two companions following close behind. She spotted the heater immediately and pointed at it with one manicured finger. That's a fire hazard and a clear violation of Ridgewood Heights Community Standards, Section 4, Paragraph 9. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling heat rise in my face that had nothing to do with the kerosene heater. "That's a perfectly legal, approved heating device. I use it to keep my workshop warm. It's a combustible fuel source in an enclosed residential structure," Patricia declared, flipping open her notebook and scribbling something down. "The HOA covenant clearly states that all heating sources must be permanently installed and approved by the Architectural Review Committee." "That's for permanent modifications to the property," I countered. "This is portable equipment. It's like saying I can't use a space heater." "This is not a space heater, Mr. Morrison. This is a kerosene heater that poses a significant danger to the entire community. What if there's a leak? What if it tips over? What if the fumes cause carbon monoxide poisoning?" She was building herself up into a frenzy now, her voice getting higher with each question. "It has a tip-over safety switch, a carbon monoxide sensor, and I only use it when I'm actively working out here," I explained, trying to keep my voice level. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but this heater is completely safe and legal." Patricia shook her head vigorously. "I'm afraid I can't accept that. As of right now, I'm issuing an emergency confiscation order. This heater needs to be removed from the premises immediately until we can get proper documentation that it meets community standards." "You're going to what?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You can't just confiscate my property." "Section 12, Paragraph 6, Patricia recited from memory. "The HOA board has the authority to remove any item deemed an immediate danger to community safety, health, or property values. You'll get it back once you provide the proper documentation and pay the administrative processing fee." "This is insane," I said, but Patricia was already gesturing to her companions. One of them, a balding man in his 50s whose name I think was Gerald, moved toward the heater. Don't touch that while it's still warm, I warned. Give it at least 20 minutes to cool down completely. Patricia made another note in her book. We'll return in 20 minutes to collect the hazardous material. In the meantime, Mr. Morrison, consider this your official warning. Any further violations will result in fines of $250 per day until compliance is achieved. They left, and I stood there in my garage feeling like I had just been mugged. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor Dave Martinez, who had lived in Ridgewood Heights for almost 15 years. Dave, did you file a complaint about my heater? I asked when he picked up. What? No, man. What heater? He sounded genuinely confused. I explained the situation, and Dave let out a low whistle. That sounds like Patricia, all right. She tried to fine me last year for having my trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day. Never mind that it was collection day just 2 hours early. Cost me $300 to fight it, and I still lost. She can't just take my property though, right? You'd think. But the HOA covenants you signed when you bought the house give them a scary amount of power. My advice: get everything in writing and document everything. Patricia has a habit of making up rules as she goes along. After hanging up with Dave, I spent the next 15 minutes photographing my heater from every angle, including clear shots of the safety certification stickers and the model number. I also found my receipt and the instruction manual, which I photographed as well. By the time Patricia and her crew returned, I had created a complete digital record of everything. Gerald and the other board member, a woman named Susan something, carefully lifted the cooled heater and carried it to Patricia's silver Lexus SUV. I watched them load it into the back, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. You'll receive a formal notice in the mail within 5 business days, Patricia informed me. That notice will include instructions for appealing the confiscation and the requirements for having your property returned. I want a receipt, I said firmly. You're taking my property, I want documentation. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she scribbled something on a piece of paper torn from her notebook and thrust it at me. It read, 1 kerosene heater, confiscated for safety violation, January 14th. She had signed it with an elaborate signature and dated it. After they left, I went inside my house and immediately started researching my options. My wife Rachel had taken our daughter Emma to her Saturday gymnastics class, so I had the quiet I needed to think clearly. I pulled up the Ridgewood Heights HOA covenant documents on my computer and started reading through them carefully. Section 12. Paragraph 6 did technically give the board authority to remove immediate dangers, but the language was clearly intended for things like dead trees about to fall on houses or broken fences with exposed nails. The idea that it could be applied to a certified, approved heating device seemed like a massive stretch. I kept reading and found Section 18, which outlined the appeals process. According to the covenant, I had the right to request a hearing before the full board within 10 days of any disciplinary action. I drafted an email to the HOA board that afternoon, formally requesting a hearing and attaching copies of all my documentation about the heater. I included the manufacturer specifications, the safety certifications from both UL and CSA, and even a printout from the Idaho State Fire Code showing that portable kerosene heaters were legal for use in residential garages as long as proper ventilation was maintained. Rachel came home around 3 in the afternoon with Emma, who immediately ran to show me the ribbon she had earned in her gymnastics class. I hugged her tight, feeling grateful for the moment of normalcy. "What's wrong?" Rachel asked after Emma ran off to her room. My wife had always been able to read my moods with uncanny accuracy. I explained the situation with Patricia and the heater, watching Rachel's expression shift from confusion to anger. She just took it, just like that. Rachel's voice had an edge to it that I recognized. My wife was normally the most patient, understanding person I knew, but when someone crossed a line with our family, she became a force of nature. Apparently, the HOA covenant gives them that authority if they deem something an immediate danger. A certified heater is an immediate danger. That's ridiculous. What are you going to do? I've already requested a hearing. We'll see what they say. The formal notice arrived not in 5 business days but 3 days later on Tuesday afternoon. It was even more absurd than I had anticipated. The letter, signed by Patricia and the HOA president Ronald Hutchins, stated that my kerosene heater violated multiple sections of the community covenant, including regulations about outdoor storage of combustible materials, restrictions on automotive repair work in residential garages, and a clause about maintaining the aesthetic standards of the community. None of these things had anything to do with a portable heater used inside my garage. It was like they had just thrown every possible violation at me to see what would stick. The letter also informed me that my hearing had been scheduled for the evening of January 28th, a full 2 weeks away, and that the administrative processing fee for the confiscation was $350, payable before the hearing. I called the HOA management company the next morning. A tired-sounding woman named Jennifer answered and listened to my complaint. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Morrison," Jennifer said, "but the board has full authority over disciplinary matters. The management company just handles the day-to-day operations and finances. So you're telling me there's nothing you can do? I can make a note of your concerns in the file, but decisions about confiscations and violations are entirely up to the board members." After hanging up with Jennifer, I decided to take a different approach. I looked up the contact information for the Boise Fire Department and called their non-emergency number. After being transferred twice, I ended up speaking with a fire marshal named Thomas Brennan. "Fire Marshal Brennan speaking. How can I help you?" I explained the situation, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. Marshal Brennan listened quietly, asking a few clarifying questions about the heater model and where I had been using it. "Okay, Mr. Morrison, let me get this straight. You have a certified kerosene heater approved by both OL and CSA that you're using in a well-ventilated garage for intermittent heating while you work on projects. That's correct. And your homeowners association confiscated it because they claim it's a fire hazard." "Yes, sir." There was a pause, and then Marshal Brennan said something I didn't expect. "That's interesting, because portable kerosene heaters are perfectly legal in Idaho, including in residential garages, as long as they're used according to manufacturer instructions and local fire codes. Would you like me to send you a formal statement to that effect?" "That would be incredibly helpful, yes." "I can do better than that," Marshal Brennan continued. "I'm actually going to be in your area next week for some routine inspections. Would it be all right if I stopped by to take a look at your setup? If everything is up to code, I can provide you with a written certification that your garage and heating setup meet all applicable fire safety standards." I couldn't believe my luck. "That would be amazing. Thank you so much." We scheduled the inspection for the following Tuesday, January 21st, at 10 in the morning. After hanging up, I immediately sent another email to the HOA board, informing them that I had arranged for an official fire safety inspection, and that I expected all charges to be dropped once the fire marshal confirmed that my setup was legal and safe. Patricia's response came within an hour, and it was curt. "The fire marshal's opinion does not supersede HOA covenant rules. Your hearing is still scheduled for January 28th. I showed the email to Rachel that evening, and she shook her head in disbelief. She's unbelievable. Even if an actual fire safety expert says it's fine, she's still going to try to fight it, apparently. But at least I'll have professional documentation on my side. The next week dragged by slowly. The temperature in Boise stayed cold, hovering in the teens and low 20s, and I missed having my heated workshop. I tried using an electric space heater instead, but it didn't put out nearly enough heat to make the garage comfortable for extended periods. My work on Emma's birthday cabinet ground to a halt. On Saturday morning, Dave Martinez came by to check on me. He brought coffee from the local shop and a sympathetic ear. "How's the HOA situation going?" he asked as we sat in my cold garage, our breath visible in the frigid air. "Fire Marshal is coming on Tuesday to inspect and hopefully clear everything. Hearing with the board is the following Monday." Dave nodded slowly. "I hate to say this, but you should prepare for Patricia to dig in her heels even with official documentation. Last year, Mrs. Chen down the street tried to fight a violation for having the wrong shade of white paint on her fence. She brought paint samples, manufacturer specs, everything. Patricia refused to budge, and Mrs. Chen ended up having to repaint her entire fence at a cost of about $2,000. That's insane. How is she still in charge? Most people don't come to the HOA meetings, so Patricia and her little group just keep voting themselves back into power. Plus, fighting them is expensive and time-consuming. A lot of residents just give up and pay whatever fines they're hit with because it's easier than battling the HOA. I felt my determination harden. Well, I'm not going to just roll over. That heater cost me $400, and I'm not paying them $350 in fees for the privilege of getting it back. Dave raised his coffee cup in a toast. "Good for you, man. I hope you win this." Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. Fire Marshal Brennan showed up right at 10 in a marked fire department vehicle. He was a tall man in his late 40s with graying hair and a professional demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "Mr. Morrison." "I'm Thomas Brennan," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Thank you so much for coming out, Marshal Brennan. Call me Tom. Let's take a look at this setup that's causing so much trouble." I walked him through my garage, explaining how I had been using the space as a workshop and how the kerosene heater had allowed me to work comfortably during the winter months. Tom examined the ventilation, checked the smoke detectors, and asked detailed questions about my safety procedures. "Do you keep the kerosene fuel stored in here?" he asked. "No, sir. I keep the approved safety container in my outdoor shed, properly sealed and away from any ignition sources." "Good. And you mentioned you only run the heater when you're actively working out here. That's right." "I never leave it unattended, and I always make sure it's completely cooled down before I leave." Tom nodded approvingly. He spent about 30 minutes going through everything, taking photos and making notes on a tablet. Finally, he straightened up and smiled. "Mr. Morrison, I'm happy to report that your garage setup exceeds the requirements of Idaho Fire Code. You have proper ventilation, working smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, appropriate clearances from combustible materials, and from what you've described, you're following all manufacturer safety guidelines for the heater itself." Relief flooded through me. "So I can get a written statement to that effect?" "Absolutely. I'll email you a formal inspection report by end of business today, and I'm also going to include a letter specifically addressing the type of heater you were using. These portable kerosene heaters are approved for residential use throughout Idaho. There's no legal basis for your HOA to ban them or confiscate them. Thank you so much, Tom. You have no idea how much this helps. Tom's expression turned a bit more serious. I do want to give you a heads up, though. HOAs can be tricky. Even though they can't override state fire codes or safety regulations, they do have broad authority under their covenants to make rules about property use. They might try to frame this as a covenant violation rather than a safety issue. I've thought about that, but the covenant sections they cited in their notice don't actually apply to what I was doing. I think they're just hoping I won't fight back. Well, you've got the fire department on your side, for whatever that's worth. Good luck with your hearing. True to his word, Tom emailed me the complete inspection report and certification letter that same afternoon. The documents were thorough and professional, clearly stating that my garage met all applicable fire safety codes and that portable kerosene heaters like mine were approved for residential use when used according to manufacturer guidelines. I immediately forwarded everything to the HOA board with a polite but firm email requesting that my heater be returned and all violations be dismissed. Patricia's response came the next morning. Your documentation has been noted and will be considered at your hearing on January 28th. The hearing will proceed as scheduled. I was starting to understand what Dave had meant about Patricia digging in her heels. She wasn't going to back down just because she was wrong. This had become about power and control, not about actual safety concerns. The weekend before the hearing, I decided to do some more research into Ridgewood Heights HOA and Patricia specifically. What I found was disturbing. Going through old neighborhood Facebook posts and archived emails, I discovered that Patricia had been involved in at least a dozen similar disputes over the past 3 years. She had fined residents for everything from lawn ornaments to the wrong brand of mailbox to parking commercial vehicles in driveways, even when those vehicles were just pickup trucks that people used for commuting. Most concerning was a post from about 18 months ago, where someone named Julia had written about Patricia entering her backyard without permission to photograph what she claimed were covenant violations. Several other residents had commented with similar experiences, describing Patricia as being on a power trip and suggesting that she had some kind of personal vendetta against anyone who questioned her authority. I also discovered that there had been an effort last year to recall Patricia from the board, but it had failed because not enough homeowners had participated in the vote. According to the covenant rules, a recall required 60% of all homeowners to vote in favor, not just 60% of those who voted. With only about 30% of residents participating in HOA matters, reaching that threshold was nearly impossible. Armed with this information, I started preparing for the hearing like I was preparing for trial. I created a binder with tabbed sections including the original purchase receipt for the heater, the manufacturer specifications and safety certifications, printouts of Idaho Fire Code regulations, the fire marshal's inspection report and letter, photos of my garage setup, and a timeline of all communications with the HOA. I also printed out excerpts from the HOA covenant, highlighting the sections they had cited and showing how none of them actually applied to my situation. Rachel helped me put together a short presentation, and we practiced my talking points. Emma, who was 7 and sharp as a tack, listened to one of our practice sessions and asked, "Daddy, why is that lady being so mean?" I knelt down to her level. Sometimes people get a little too focused on following rules, even when the rules don't make sense. I'm just trying to explain to them why they made a mistake. "Oh," Emma said thoughtfully. "Like when I got in trouble for running in the hallway at school, but I was actually running because there was a bee chasing me. Exactly like that, sweetheart." The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I kept going over my arguments in my head, anticipating objections and preparing responses. Rachel found me at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, reviewing my notes. "Come back to bed," she said gently. "You're as prepared as you can be." Getting exhausted won't help. I know. I just keep thinking about all the ways Patricia might try to twist things around. Rachel sat down next to me and took my hand. "You have the fire marshal on your side. You have documentation. You have the actual fire codes. She can't argue with that. Dave says she'll try anyway. Then you stand your ground. You're not wrong here, Mark. Don't let her bully you into thinking you are." The hearing was scheduled for 7 that evening at the Ridgewood Heights Community Clubhouse. I arrived at 6:45 with my binder and a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The clubhouse was a bland beige building with a small parking lot and a meeting room that could hold about 30 people. When I walked in, I saw that the 5 board members were already seated at a long table at the front of the room. Patricia, Ronald Hutchins, the president, Gerald, whose last name I learned was Stokes, Susan Palmer, and a younger guy named Kevin Morrison, no relation. About 15 other residents were scattered throughout the folding chairs, including Dave, who gave me an encouraging nod. I recognized a few other faces from the neighborhood, but didn't know most of them by name. Ronald called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and a perpetually tired expression. "We're here tonight to address a violation issued to Marcus Morrison of 2847 Elderberry Lane regarding unauthorized and hazardous heating equipment. Patricia, would you like to present the HOA's case?" Patricia stood up, smoothing down her navy blazer. "Thank you, Ronald. On January 14th of this year, I received a complaint from a concerned resident regarding a kerosene heater being operated in Mr. Morrison's garage. Upon inspection, I confirmed the presence of this dangerous device, and in accordance with Section 12, Paragraph 6 of our covenant, issued an emergency confiscation order." She went on for several more minutes, describing the heater in terms that made it sound like I had been operating a bomb factory in my garage. She talked about the risks of carbon monoxide poisoning, fire hazards, explosion dangers, and even mentioned property values, claiming that if word got out that residents were using dangerous improvised heating methods, it could negatively impact home prices throughout the neighborhood. When she finally finished, Ronald turned to me. "Mr. Morrison, you have 15 minutes to present your response." I stood up, trying to project calm confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Thank you. First, I want to be very clear about what we're actually discussing here. I purchased a new, certified portable kerosene heater from Home Depot for use in my garage workshop. This heater is approved by both HOA and CSA, which are nationally recognized safety certification organizations. It has multiple safety features including automatic shut-off, tip-over protection, and carbon monoxide sensors. I opened my binder and pulled out the manufacturer specs, walking them up to the board table. Here are the complete specifications for the heater, including all safety certifications. You'll see that this is not some improvised or dangerous device. This is a commercially sold, widely used heating product that meets or exceeds all applicable safety standards." Patricia started to interrupt, but Ronald held up his hand. "Let him finish, please." Second, and most importantly, I arranged for an official inspection by the Boise Fire Department. Fire Marshal Thomas Brennan came to my home, inspected my garage, and issued this report. I pulled out Tom's inspection report and letter, making copies for each board member from a folder I had prepared. As you can see, Marshal Brennan confirmed that my garage setup meets all Idaho fire codes and that portable kerosene heaters like mine are explicitly approved for residential use. I paused to let that sink in. A few of the board members were actually reading the documents, though Patricia was just staring at me with undisguised hostility. Third, the covenant violations cited in the notice I received don't actually apply to this situation. Section 4, Paragraph 9 deals with permanent heating installations like furnaces or fireplaces. Section 8, Paragraph 3 addresses outdoor storage, but the heater was used indoors in my garage. Section 10, Paragraph 12 concerns automotive repair businesses, which has nothing to do with me building furniture in my workshop. Now, just a minute, Patricia interjected, unable to contain herself any longer. The covenant gives this board broad authority to maintain community standards and safety. We don't need a specific rule against every possible dangerous activity. That's what Section 12, Paragraph 6 is for. Except my heater isn't dangerous, I replied calmly. That's what the fire marshal's report confirms. You can't claim something is an emergency danger when the actual fire safety experts say it's perfectly safe and legal. Ronald was studying the fire marshal's letter carefully. Patricia, did you consult with the fire department before issuing the confiscation order? Patricia's face flushed slightly. I didn't feel that was necessary. The danger was obvious. Obvious to you, I said, but not to the trained professional whose job it is to evaluate fire hazards. With all due respect, Patricia, you're not a fire safety expert. Marshal Brennan is, and he's saying you're wrong. The room was silent for a moment. Then Susan Palmer spoke up. I have a question. Mr. Morrison, do you keep the fuel for this heater stored in your garage as well? No, madam. I keep it in an approved safety container in my outdoor shed, away from the house and any potential ignition sources. That's also covered in the fire marshal's inspection report. Gerald looked up from the documents. Ronald, I have to say, this seems pretty clear-cut. The fire marshal says it's safe, it's legal under state code, and Mr. Morrison is using it responsibly. Kevin, the younger board member, nodded in agreement. I don't see how we can argue with the fire department. That seems like it should be the final word on whether something is a fire hazard or not. Patricia was looking increasingly agitated. This isn't just about fire safety. This is about maintaining standards in our community. Today it's a kerosene heater, tomorrow it's propane tanks and gas generators and who knows what else. We need to draw a line. The line is already drawn, I said firmly. It's drawn by state and local fire codes which I'm following. The HOA doesn't have the authority to ban things that are legal and approved by the fire marshal just because you personally don't like them. Ronald looked around at the other board members. I think we need to discuss this in executive session. Mr. Morrison, if you could step outside for about 10 minutes. I gathered my materials and walked out into the lobby where Dave immediately came over. You did great in there, he said. Patricia looked like she was going to explode. I just hope it's enough. We waited for closer to 20 minutes before Ronald came out and called me back in. The board members all looked slightly uncomfortable, except Patricia, who looked furious. Ronald cleared his throat. After discussion, the board has decided to return your kerosene heater and rescind the violation notice. However, we are implementing a new rule, effective immediately, requiring that any portable heating device using combustible fuel must be registered with the HOA and approved by the Architectural Review Committee before use. I felt a flash of anger. You're creating a new rule specifically to target me. That seems like retaliation. It's not targeting anyone, Ronald said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. It's establishing a clear policy going forward. You can register your heater at your convenience. There's no fee for registration. And the $350 administrative processing fee for the confiscation, that will be waived. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. When can I pick up my heater? Patricia practically spit out her response. You can collect it from the management office tomorrow between 9 and 5. I nodded. Thank you for your time. As I walked out, several of the residents who had been watching gave me quiet thumbs up or approving nods. Dave clapped me on the shoulder when I reached the parking lot. That was awesome, man. Did you see Patricia's face? I don't think anyone has ever made her back down before. I don't think she really did back down, I said. That new rule about registration is clearly her way of trying to maintain some control. Yeah, but you won. You got your heater back and you don't have to pay their bogus fee. He was right, of course. I had won the important battle. But something about the whole situation left a bad taste in my mouth. Patricia's vindictive need for control. The way the HOA could just create new rules on the spot. The fact that I'd had to spend hours of time and stress fighting for something that should have been a non-issue in the first place. I picked up my heater from the management office the next day. Jennifer, the tired-sounding woman I had spoken with on the phone, looked apologetic as she helped me load it into my truck. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I'm glad this worked out for you. Between you and me, Patricia can be very difficult to work with. How long have you been dealing with her? 3 years. She calls the office at least twice a week with some new issue or complaint. Last month, she wanted us to send violation notices to every house that still had Christmas decorations up on December 26th. I drove home feeling vindicated but exhausted. Rachel and Emma were waiting for me when I pulled into the garage. You got it back, Emma cheered. I did, sweetheart. Now I can finish your birthday cabinet. Over the next few days, I settled back into my workshop routine, grateful to have my warm garage back. I even filled out the ridiculous registration form for the heater, figuring it wasn't worth another fight. But I kept thinking about all the other residents Patricia had probably bullied over the years. People who hadn't fought back because they didn't know they could or didn't have the energy to deal with the hassle. About a week after the hearing, I received an unexpected phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Julia, the woman whose Facebook post I had found during my research. Hi, Mr. Morrison. This is Julia Henderson. I live over on Maple Drive. Dave Martinez gave me your number and said it would be okay to call. Sure. What can I do for you? I heard about your fight with Patricia over the heater. I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to her. She's made life miserable for a lot of us, and it's really encouraging to see someone actually win against her. Well, thank you. It was frustrating, but I'm glad it worked out. Listen, I know this might be awkward, but a few of us have been talking, and we're wondering if you'd be interested in running for the HOA board in the next election. It's coming up in March, and we really need people who are willing to stand up to Patricia and bring some sanity back to the board. I was taken completely off guard. I appreciate that, but I don't know anything about running an HOA. Neither does Patricia, clearly, Julia said with a laugh. Seriously, though, you don't need special expertise. You just need to be reasonable and willing to listen to residents instead of treating them like criminals. We've got about 40 homeowners who are fed up with the current board, and we're organizing to try to get some new people elected. It would be great if you'd consider it. I told her I'd think about it and discuss it with Rachel. That evening over dinner, I mentioned the conversation. Rachel was thoughtful. It would be a lot of work. HOA board positions are volunteer, right? Yeah, no pay. Just the joy of dealing with neighborhood politics. But if you don't do it, people like Patricia stay in charge and keep making everyone's life harder. She had a point. The next day, I called Julia back and told her I'd run for one of the open board positions. The election campaign was surprisingly intense for something so local. Patricia and her allies put up signs and sent out mailers painting themselves as the defenders of property values and community standards. Our group, which ended up being about a dozen residents working together, focused on transparency, reasonableness, and following actual rules rather than making up arbitrary restrictions. I attended neighborhood coffee meetings, knocked on doors, and talked to a lot of residents who shared stories about their own frustrations with the HOA board. There was Tom and Amy Chen, who had been forced to repaint their fence. There was Michael Rodriguez, who got fined for having his daughter's small plastic playhouse visible from the street. There was elderly Mrs. Patterson, who received a violation notice for having weeds in her lawn when she was recovering from surgery and couldn't maintain her yard for a few weeks. The stories went on, and they all followed the same pattern. Patricia and her board making mountains out of molehills, enforcing rules selectively and vindictively, and showing no flexibility or compassion for residents' actual circumstances. Election day was March 15th. The voting took place at the clubhouse from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. Rachel and I both voted, and then we waited anxiously for the results. The turnout was unusually high, according to Jennifer from the management company, with almost 60% of homeowners casting ballots. The results were announced at a special meeting on March 17th. Our reform slate won 3 of the 5 open positions, including mine. Patricia retained her seat but lost her majority control. Ronald chose not to run for re-election and was replaced by Julia, who won her race handily. Patricia's face when the results were announced was something I'd never forget. She looked like she had bitten into a lemon, her expression a mixture of shock and rage. She didn't attend the reception afterward where residents mingled and congratulated the new board members. My first board meeting was on March 25th, and it was immediately clear that things were going to be different. Julia was elected as the new president, and I was voted in as treasurer. Patricia remained as vice president, but with significantly less power than she'd enjoyed before. One of our first acts was to review all outstanding violations and fines. We found dozens of cases where residents had been cited for minor or questionable issues. We systematically went through them, dismissing anything that wasn't a clear violation of reasonable covenant rules and refunding fines that had been improperly assessed. Patricia objected to almost every decision. When we voted to dismiss a violation against a resident who had planted flowers in their front yard without architectural committee approval, Patricia argued that it set a dangerous precedent for chaos. When we refunded a fine to someone who had been cited for having their garage door open during the day, she warned that we were destroying property values and community standards. But she was consistently outvoted, and I could see her frustration growing with each meeting. The real confrontation came in April when we began investigating the HOA's finances more carefully. As treasurer, I had access to all the financial records, and what I found was concerning. Over the past 3 years, under Patricia's leadership, the HOA had spent nearly $40,000 on legal fees related to enforcement actions and covenant disputes. Most of these cases had resulted in either settlements or the HOA backing down, meaning that money had been spent on Patricia's vendetta campaigns without any benefit to the community. Additionally, I discovered that Patricia had been approving payments to herself for administrative expenses and community service work that totaled about $8,000 over 2 years. The covenant did allow for reasonable reimbursement of board member expenses, But Patricia had never disclosed these payments to the general membership, and many of them seemed questionable. She had charged the HOA for gas mileage for driving around the neighborhood looking for violations, for her cell phone bill because she used it for HOA business, and even for dry cleaning expenses because she needed to look professional when representing the community. I brought this information to Julia, and we decided to raise it at the next board meeting. Patricia's reaction was explosive. "How dare you question my service to this community?" she shouted when Julia asked her to explain the payments. "I have devoted countless hours to protecting property values and maintaining our standards. That compensation is completely justified and within the covenant rules." "The covenant requires disclosure," Julia said calmly. "These payments should have been reported in the annual budget and approved by the membership. They were administrative matters within the board's discretion," Patricia snapped. "Patricia, you paid yourself $8,000 over 2 years without telling anyone," I said. "That's not transparency, that's self-dealing." Kevin, one of the other new board members, nodded. "I'm going to be honest, Patricia. This looks really bad. If this gets out to the general membership, they're going to be furious." Patricia's face was red. "Are you threatening me?" "Nobody's threatening you," Julia said. "But we need to address this properly. I'm proposing that we conduct a full financial audit going back 3 years, and that we establish new policies requiring board approval and membership disclosure for any payments to board members." The motion passed 4-1, with only Patricia voting against it. She stormed out of the meeting immediately afterward, and I wondered if we'd seen the last of her. We hadn't. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia launched a counterattack. She sent out an email blast to all homeowners claiming that the new board was fiscally irresponsible, that we were planning to raise HOA dues, and that we were putting the community at risk by being lax on enforcement. She organized a petition calling for a special election to recall the new board members, though she only managed to get about 20 signatures. More seriously, she began filing her own complaints against board members. I received a violation notice claiming that my lawn was overgrown, even though I had mowed it 3 days earlier. Julia got cited for having an unauthorized door wreath. Kevin was told his house numbers weren't the approved font. It was petty harassment, and it was incredibly frustrating. But we didn't retaliate. We simply dismissed the bogus violations and continued with our work. The financial audit was completed in early May by an independent accounting firm. The results confirmed what I had suspected. Patricia had indeed taken payments that should have been disclosed, and the HOA's legal spending under her leadership had been excessive and poorly documented. The auditor's report also noted several instances where HOA funds had been spent without proper authorization, including the purchase of Patricia's leather-bound notebook and several other office supplies that she kept at her personal residence. Nothing rose to the level of criminal conduct, but it was clear evidence of poor governance and ethical lapses. Julia scheduled a special membership meeting for May 12th to present the audit results and proposed new policies. The meeting was packed, with over 100 homeowners attending. Julia presented the audit findings clearly and professionally, without editorializing or attacking Patricia personally. The numbers spoke for themselves. When she finished, there was a stunned silence. Then Mrs. Chen stood up. "I was fined $300 for my fence." Meanwhile, Patricia was paying herself thousands of dollars in secret. That's outrageous. Other residents began voicing similar sentiments. The anger in the room was palpable, and it was all directed at Patricia, who sat rigid in her seat, her face pale. Finally, Patricia stood up. "I have done nothing wrong. Everything I did was within my authority as a board officer. If this community doesn't appreciate my service, then I'll save you all the trouble of these witch hunts." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. "This is my resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately. You can all watch your property values plummet without my guidance. I'm also putting my house on the market. I won't stay in a community that treats dedicated volunteers like criminals." With that, she walked out. The room erupted in conversation, some people looking shocked, others looking relieved, and a few actually applauding. Julia called the meeting back to order. "Well, that was unexpected. We'll need to hold a special election to fill Patricia's position, but in the meantime, let's vote on the proposed financial policies." The new policies passed unanimously. They included requirements for full transparency on all HOA spending, membership approval for any payments to board members beyond standard reimbursement of receipted expenses, quarterly financial reports to be posted online, and a restriction on legal spending without board vote. Patricia was true to her word about selling her house. A for sale sign went up in her yard the next week, and the house sold within a month to a young couple with 2 small kids. I met them when they moved in and was relieved to find them friendly and normal. The special election to fill Patricia's seat was held in June, and Michael Rodriguez won easily. The new board continued working on reforms, including simplifying the architectural review process and establishing clear guidelines for what actually constituted a covenant violation versus what was just a personal preference. We also established a formal appeals process that didn't require residents to wait weeks for a hearing, and we created a community advisory committee made up of homeowners who could provide input on board decisions. By the end of summer, Ridgewood Heights felt like a different place. The constant tension and fear of arbitrary enforcement was gone. People were more willing to actually use and enjoy their properties instead of worrying about being cited for some minor infraction. The Facebook group shifted from being a place to complain about the HOA to being a place to organize neighborhood events and support each other. I continued working on woodworking projects in my garage, with my kerosene heater keeping me warm through the next winter. Emma's birthday cabinet had turned out beautifully, and I was working on a matching bookshelf for her room. One evening in late September, I was out in the garage when Dave stopped by with a couple of beers. "You know," he said, settling onto a stool, "when you first moved in 3 years ago, I never would have guessed you'd end up basically reforming the entire HOA." I laughed. "I never would have guessed it either. I just wanted to keep my workshop warm." "Well, you did a lot more than that. This neighborhood is actually pleasant to live in now. My kids can play in the front yard without me worrying that someone's going to complain that their toys are visible from the street. How's it supposed to be, right? Hey, I heard Patricia moved to some community in Eagle that has even stricter HOA rules. Apparently, she's already joined their board." "God help them," I said, raising my beer in a mock toast. We both laughed, and I felt genuinely at peace. The fight over my kerosene heater had been frustrating and stressful, but it had led to real positive change for everyone in Ridgewood Heights. Sometimes standing up to unreasonable authority, even over something small, can make a real difference. The fire marshal's report still hung framed in my garage, a reminder that being right doesn't matter if you don't have the courage to fight for it. Next to it, I had hung the official letter from the HOA board dismissing all violations and returning my property. Both documents represented not just my personal victory, but a small triumph against the kind of petty tyranny that HOAs can sometimes become. As I worked on Emma's bookshelf that evening, the kerosene heater humming quietly and putting out its steady warmth, I thought about how much had changed in just 9 months. An entire community had been transformed because people decided they'd had enough of being bullied and were willing to work together to make things better. It wasn't a dramatic story of revolution or massive protest. It was just neighbors deciding to actually participate in their community governance and choosing reasonable people to lead them. But in its own small way, it mattered. It made real people's lives better in real, tangible ways. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I was already reviewing the agenda. There was a proposal to add benches at the community playground, a discussion about refreshing the landscaping at the entrance, and a review of the snow removal contract for the coming winter. Normal, reasonable stuff that actually served the community rather than terrorizing it. I finished a section of sanding and stood back to admire my work. The bookshelf was coming together nicely, and Emma was going to love it. Through the garage window, I could see Rachel and Emma in the kitchen, probably making cookies if I knew them. It was a quiet, ordinary evening in Ridgewood Heights. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. The story of my seized kerosene heater had become something of a legend in the neighborhood, a tale that got retold at block parties and homeowners' meetings as an example of why documentation matters and why it's important to know your rights. Fire Marshal Brennan had even stopped by a few months later to check on how everything had turned out, pleased to hear that his report had helped resolve the situation. Life in Ridgewood Heights settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA still existed and still enforced reasonable rules, but now it felt like a genuine community organization rather than a hostile police force. When violations were issued, they were for actual problems like truly overgrown lawns or safety hazards, not for having the wrong shade of beige on your mailbox. I served out my 3-year term on the board and then stepped down, having done what I'd set out to do. Julia continued as president, and under her leadership, Ridgewood Heights became known in the area as one of the better-managed HOA communities, attracting new residents who were tired of overly restrictive neighborhoods. My garage remained my sanctuary, a place where I could work on projects and create things for my family. The kerosene heater served me faithfully for years, never once causing a problem or posing any danger, exactly as the fire marshal had certified it wouldn't. Looking back, the whole experience taught me valuable lessons about standing up for yourself, the importance of documentation and professional opinions, and the power of community organizing. It also taught me that sometimes the people who talk the most about rules and standards are the ones who need the most oversight themselves. Patricia's legacy in Ridgewood Heights faded quickly, replaced by a new culture of reasonable governance and mutual respect among neighbors. Her name occasionally came up in conversations as a cautionary tale, but mostly people just moved on, grateful to live in a community where they could enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary enforcement. And my kerosene heater. It sat in my garage, properly registered with the HOA as their silly rule required, keeping my workshop warm and comfortable through many more winter projects. Every time I fired it up, I remembered the whole ordeal and felt a small sense of satisfaction that common sense and proper documentation had prevailed over petty tyranny. The cabinet and bookshelf I built for Emma became treasured pieces in her room, and as she grew older, she sometimes asked to help with projects in the garage. I'd teach her about safety, about measuring twice and cutting once, and about the importance of having the right tools for the job. Maybe someday she'd have her own workshop, and maybe she'd even need her own kerosene heater. And if some future HOA tried to give her trouble about it, well, I'd make sure she knew exactly what documentation to gather and which authorities to contact. The lessons I'd learned weren't just about heating devices or HOA covenants. They were about knowing your rights, standing your ground when you're right, and not letting anyone bully you into accepting unreasonable treatment. Years later, when I finally sold that house and moved to a property without an HOA, one of the things I made sure to take with me was that kerosene heater. It had become more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of a battle fought and won, of a community improved, and of the power of one person standing up and saying, "No, you're wrong, and here's why." The heater still works perfectly, sitting in my new workshop, ready to provide warmth whenever I need it. And every time I use it, I remember that cold January morning when Patricia Hendricks knocked on my garage door and set in motion a chain of events that changed an entire neighborhood for the better. Sometimes the smallest battles lead to the most important victories.